Ukraine is now making moves to end the war. So where is the most important region for the end of this war? As we all guess, the common red line of Ukraine and Russia is the Crimean Peninsula. Recently, Russia has been implementing purely defensive policies on the peninsula. The main reason for this, of course, is that the Ukrainians target Crimea from all directions with drones and long-range missiles, while Russia couldn't resist these attacks. Kiev's big offensive plans against Crimea expanded over time. In particular, the Storm Shadow long-range missiles sent by the United Kingdom to Ukraine further strengthened Kiev's plans for Crimea in order to cut off the Russians' connections with Crimea. The Ukrainians set their sights on the most strategic location. This is the Kirch Bridge. Russia uses the Kirch Bridge to support the invasion operation on Ukrainian territory and to connect with the city of Krasnodar on the Sea of Azov. In other words, we can liken this bridge to Russia's lifeblood in logistics and supply. In addition, the Kirch Bridge is seen as an escape point for Russian military and political officials from Crimea and residents of the region who are supporters of Moscow in case of any attack on the peninsula. For this reason, Ukraine has focused on the Kirch Bridge in order to end this war and to regain Russia's claims on the peninsula. If you remember, the last time the Ukrainians attacked this bridge was on October 8, 2022. This date was only one day after the birthday of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Ukrainians stated that the attack was a birthday surprise for the Russian leader. But now a brand new attack has occurred on the Kerch Bridge. This striking attack had wide repercussions on the world agenda. The Ukrainian armed forces attacked the Kerch Bridge with British-made Storm Shadow long-range missiles. There is still time for Putin's birthday, but the Ukrainians have prepared a brand new gift for Putin with this attack. We think that the Russian leader seems to have received his birthday present early this year because the attack on the Kerch Bridge shook the Crimea. The pro-Russian Sergei Aksyonov in Crimea reported that air defense systems are working urgently on the peninsula. Aksyonov also added that a cruise missile had crashed near the bridge. White smoke around the Kerch Bridge was quite striking in the footage of the attack. It is claimed that this attack on the Kerch Bridge damaged Russia's 19-kilometer connection line. Although there aren't many details about this, the Russians seem to be seriously worried about this already. If the Storm Shadow missiles targeted the Kerch Bridge, that means they were launched from a distance of about 300 kilometers. If you remember last week, Ukrainian forces deployed short-range ballistic missiles near the borders of Crimea. These developments highlight the fact that the Kerch Bridge can be targeted from long distances. The attack on this bridge in Crimea pointed out that one of the most important main supply lines of the Russians was cut, as well as that Ukraine was taking much bolder moves in this regard. Ukrainian leader Zelensky announced that Russian ships cannot dictate conditions in the Black Sea and will be afraid to approach the Crimea. The president recalled the Russian missile cruiser Moskva was destroyed by Ukrainian missiles. It's not known whether these statements by Zelensky implied the attacks on the Kerch Bridge, but for the moment, the Kiev authorities prefer to remain silent about the bridge attack. Clearly, no Ukrainian official has commented on the recent attack on the Kerch Bridge. According to the reports of international intelligence sources, the Storm Shadow missile attack on the Kerch Bridge after Zelensky's statement is a sign that the Ukrainian army has started to take steps to end the war, since Russia also threatened Ukraine with navy forces. Zelensky had repeatedly shown with his statements that he would not bow to the threats of the Russians and that the Ukrainians would attack the peninsula from all directions. If you remember, an explosion occurred in Sevastopol, the main port of Russia's Black Sea Navy fleet. In the past weeks, the Russians on the peninsula were shaken by the huge explosion. This is because, although Moscow has moved part of the Russian Black Sea Fleet to the port of Novorossiysk, there are still Russian ships in Sevastopol. With these attacks of the Ukrainians on Sevastopol, the threats of the Russians to blockade the Ukrainian coastline by using their navy have actually disappeared in a way. In addition, the fact that a Russian military base in Krasnodar was attacked by air on the same dates was an indication of how sensitive the Ukrainians were to the Crimea. The targeting of the Krasnodar air base by drones also alarmed the residents of Crimea who were considering using the Kirch Bridge. The reason for this is that the residents of Crimea are now willing to leave because of the recent attacks on the peninsula, and one of the most convenient ways to escape is the Kirch Bridge. When we consider all these attacks in Crimea, we can see that the Ukrainians have started to have a much greater say in the peninsula, and they can target this critical region with UAVs or long-range missiles whenever they want in the face of this critical situation. The only solution for the residents of Crimea seems to be to flee. Considering that the war will become much more violent in time and there will be no escape route anymore, those in Crimea do not have much time to think. So how do we know when the war is moving? If you've noticed, the tension is too high across the territory of Ukraine. The continuation of Kiev's offensive plans, especially on the southern front lines of the country, and the purpose of the Ukrainian armed forces is to build a connecting corridor extending to Crimea, seriously restricts Moscow in these regions. The increase in the offensive operations of the Ukrainians, especially in regions such as Zaporizhia, Melitopol, and Kherson, is one of the biggest factors that increases the threats against Crimea, because even though Kherson is under the control of the Ukrainians, there are Russian military groups in this region. But Ukrainian forces want to take full control of Crimea using the most strategic centers in Kherson. But the missiles that can reach from Kherson to Crimea may not be enough for Ukraine to save the peninsula in this regard. Of course, the military support of the West and the USA is very important. The United States recently announced an $800 million military aid package to Ukraine, but much more is needed than this aid. If the Ukrainians want to liberate Crimea, the West and the United States should provide the Ukrainian army with longer-range missile systems. Only in this way can Crimea be liberated. Of course, drone strikes or partisan actions may cause anxiety or evacuation on the peninsula. But if Ukraine wants a clear victory, it should also target Russian military resources on the peninsula with long-range missiles. Russia, on the other hand, seems quite helpless in this regard. Moscow authorities have focused only on defense issues so as not to lose the peninsula. Currently, we can see that the Russians are still building fortifications in the Crimea and that they are trying to create a serious defense shield in other important ports on the peninsula, especially in Sevastopol. So what are the Ukrainians doing as the Russians step up their defensive measures after the recent missile attack on the Kerch Bridge? In fact, the offensive plans of the Ukrainians continue from where they left off, in addition to regions such as Crimea, Kherson, Melitopol, and Zaporizhia. Ukrainians are also making a serious military effort near the Dnipro River. The last time the Russians lost a lot of their boats on this river, the Ukrainians, on the other hand, started to increase their repressive attacks around Dnipro after this time period, because the aim of Kiev here is to blockade Crimea from all sides. When we think about it, the Ukrainians taking control of all areas in the Dnipro River means the superiority of Kiev and Kherson. As we mentioned in Kherson, Crimea is a region that sees it from the front. Therefore, in the war diary of Ukrainians, every road actually leads to Crimea. Even clashes on the country's eastern front lines seem to have affected the situation of Ukrainian forces in Crimea. Ukrainians' willingness to take control of the eastern front lines may actually allow Kiev to focus much more on its offensive plans in Crimea. Therefore, the views of war analysts and experts on this issue are quite logical. But in order to confirm this thesis, the Ukrainians must first take control of both the eastern and southern front lines and finally make the finishing move in the Crimea. For this purpose, the Kirch Bridge was on target for the time being. So where is the next region that the Ukrainians are eyeing? If one side in a war has realized the pointlessness of the war and has recognized the superiority of the other side, there is no rational explanation for the continuation of the war. And when we look at the situation of the Russian army, we see that it has accepted many things since the beginning of the war. The Ukrainian army has been achieving great successes against the Russian army, and almost the whole world is aware of the military success of the Ukrainian army because the Ukrainian army has no difficulty in reclaiming its lost territories and cleansing all the Russian invaders from its territory one by one. This stability and success of the Ukrainian army completely frightens the Russian army, and they know that they have no chance in this war. Almost nobody in Russia supports this war, and the Russian people are strongly against this decision to invade. And nobody wants to be part of this war that Putin started for his own interests. The Ukraine-Russia war has shown the helplessness of the Russian army and have difficult situation is the Russian people are aware from the very beginning that the war is pointless. But the Russian army does not even want to be on the battlefield because the Russian army is also aware of the great truth. This realization is leading them to surrender. Let's take a look at how the Russian army surrendered and the details of the events. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense shared some information about these developments. Ukraine has recaptured many regions occupied by Russia and inflicted huge losses on the Russian army in these regions. Although the fighting between Ukraine and the Russian army is still ongoing in the Kherson region, Ukraine has made great progress in Kherson and has retaken almost most of this region. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has released some footage of the incident in Kherson region. These images are recorded in a town in Kherson region. In the footage, Russian soldiers are seen hanging a white flag on the tank. They are using and slowly approaching Ukrainian soldiers with this tank. Suspicious of this, Ukrainian soldiers surround the Russian tank. But then something very surprising happens. The Russian soldiers stop the tank. They are driving, put their hands in the air, and get out of the tank. All three Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainian troops. When the Ukrainian army looked into the tank of the surrendered Russian soldiers, they found a large number of weapons and ammunition and confiscated them. These moments were not recorded, and the identities of the surrendered Russian soldiers were never revealed. The Ukrainian army is working with great care and sensitivity to ensure the safe return of the soldiers to their country. The statements that the surrendered Russian soldiers want to make are also hidden by the press. One of the soldiers who has served on the battlefield and wants to make a statement is Anthony. The name Anthony is a pseudonym used to prevent the soldier's true identity from being revealed. Anthony lived in Bashkortostan, a predominantly Muslim region in Russia, and Bashkortostan is still a part of the Russian Federation, although it is trying very hard to become independent from Russia. One of the biggest problems of the Russian army is the lack of soldiers. There is a huge shortage of military personnel on the front line, and one of the solutions Russia found for this problem was to involve people from Bashkortostan in the war. The Kremlin said that it would pay the people there a large sum of money if they would join the war. As a result of this pressure, many of the Po people in Bashkortostan decided to join the war, and Anthony was one of them. On the day Anthony went to the front, he saw 42 Russian soldiers being slaughtered by Ukrainian drones. And Anthony was so alarmed that he explained the events as follows. The artillery of the Ukrainian army was so accurate that they would bombard our trenches meter by meter. We had 10 rows of trenches and they started hitting each one in turn. According to Anthony, Russia had no chance against Ukraine, and Anthony realized this from day one. He tried many ways to get back to his home country, and it took many days. But Anthony finally reached his family. Anthony plans to stay in his home for a while longer, without Trillian revealing his address or identity. One by one, Russian soldiers are leaving the army because they know they cannot win this war. Many Russian soldiers are surrendering secretly to Ukrainian troops. The number of surrendered soldiers is carefully kept secret by the Ukrainian army. It is expected that the Ukrainian army will announce this number after the end of the war. Following the statements made by Ukrainian President Zelensky, more and more Russian soldiers are surrendering to Ukrainian troops. Zelensky, who can change the course of the war even with his speeches, makes phone calls to Western countries every day. And these calls are about support for Ukraine. All the leaders who talk to Zelensky want to help Ukraine more. Zelensky is keeping his country afloat thanks to his meetings and conversations. The aid to Ukraine is improving the country, the army, and the people. Zelensky is following a very good strategy in this war. After Zelensky's speeches for Russian soldiers, more Russian soldiers want to surrender to Ukrainian troops. Main thing maybe is motivation. I think that they don't have motivation. And according to war experts, this war is the war in which the most soldiers surrendered in the history of the world. With this analysis, Putin's reputation is in ruins because it is becoming common knowledge that he is a failed leader, incapable of keeping his troops in the army. Svetlana. According to the British press, there are thousands of Russian soldiers preparing to surrender in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The Ukrainian army is organizing many operations and making plans to retake these regions. Aware of this, Russian soldiers are thinking of surrendering before the Ukrainian army attacks, and many majors are involved in these preparations because they know very well that they cannot do anything against the Ukrainian army. If you look at the plans of the Russian occupiers, the Ukrainian army will easily take back the occupied territories without any great effort, because if the Russian occupiers dare lay down their arms and surrender to Ukrainian troops, it means that the Ukrainian army will be able to take back control of the territories. Ukraine government officials have issued a number of warnings to the soldiers who want to surrender as soon as possible and reiterated that the soldiers who want to surrender should contact the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government has set up a hotline called I Want to Live for soldiers who want to surrender. Thousands of Russian soldiers surrendered with the help of this communication line. Ukrainian authorities have created a secure site for Russian soldiers who want to surrender and said that they want to communicate with soldiers who want to surrender en masse. They emphasize that this is the safest way for soldiers who want to surrender. So what do you think about these developments? Do you think Putin can prevent Russian soldiers who want to surrender? The heaviest fights are taking place around Volodar and Bak Moot. Today, the Russians started storming Volodar itself, and in the first half of the day, the Russians maintained the initiative. However, the Ukrainians made a smart decision, and instead of fighting them from the city, the Ukrainians pulled their tanks from behind the hill and entered the countryside that the Russians were leveraging. This forced the Russians to stop attacking Volodar immediately and devote all of their resources to resolving the problems at hand. Last time I told you that the Russians conducted extensive artillery preparation, advanced from two sides, and started storming the outer Ukrainian positions. As a result of yesterday's fights, the Russians established control over the countryside just across the road from Volodar. Such gains allowed the Russians to start storming Volodar itself already in the morning. The Russians have also advanced from their farms in Pavlivka towards another small countryside that is located equal distance from Volodar and Pavlivka. This set conditions for attacking the hospital buildings on the corner that the Russians decimated yesterday with their thermobaric artillery systems. The hospital buildings are quite isolated as they are located around 350 meters from the main Ukrainian positions in compact blocks. So the Russians successfully capitalized on that and took control of what was left of the hospital. But the Ukrainians were not just passively defending. The Ukrainians regrouped and started counterattacking the Russians already yesterday, and today, the intensity of Ukrainian counterattacks has only increased. In order to undermine Russian defenses and push them away from the edges of the northern countryside, the Ukrainians advanced on tanks from behind the hills, moved halfway along the tree belts, and fired at Russian-occupied fortifications. Under cover of heavy fire, a mobile Ukrainian attack group rapidly crossed the field and established their positions near the first blocks. From here, they managed to expand their control over the area, and now the control over the settlement is split 50-50. This is very bad news for the Russians because they can no longer continue pushing along the main axis of advance. The presence of Ukrainian forces inside the countryside means that the Russians have to engage in positional fights. Otherwise, they would expose themselves well-trained to cross the road when it comes to the battle for Bak Moot. The last time we covered this region, the Russians concentrated their efforts on breaching the Ukrainian defense line to the north of Bak Moot and taking it into a pocket. However, more than 2 weeks after the Russians captured Soledar, the situation did not change. Last time we covered this region, the Russians were attacking Krasnaya Gora from the fields to the east and from the garden to the south. And so far the fights are still taking place in the garden. The Russians were also pushing towards Blahodayton from multiple sides. But as the Institute for the Study of War noted, even before the fall of Soledar, the Ukrainians had prepared an extensive line of fortifications, mainly in the form of trenches right behind the road. Recent reports from Russian sources mention that advances on Blahodayton from Soledar are difficult. Exactly for this reason, the only settlement that the Ukrainians lost here is Krasnopoliansky, which is located right beside Soledar, making it extremely difficult to hold. The stabilization of the front line to the north of Bak Moot and the concomitant lack of Russian progress is very good news, given that the situation to the south of Bak Moot has been slowly but steadily deteriorating. Here the Russians established control over Opitny, which they had been storming for around 4 months, and they also established control over Kulikivka, which they had been storming for almost 2 months. This allowed the Russians to establish fire control over one of the supply roads. However, the Ukrainians still have another road that goes from Classifier. This is the safest route as it is located right behind Bak Moot. Overall, a rapid attack on Volodar did not allow the Russians to penetrate Ukrainian defenses, and the Russians are back to positional fights, sustaining very high losses when it comes to Bak Moot. The Ukrainians managed to stabilize the most important part of the front line, which is around Soledar. The latest developments indicate that the Russians may be forced to shift their focus away from Bak Moot in an attempt to find defenses that are not as strong as those around Bak Moot.